respected friend, thank you so much for your kind participation in today's Swadhyay Chakra Weekly Forum Dialogue. Today we have titled this talk as Agricultural Region in the Shadow of Subsistence Capitalism, a Rural Ontology from Western India. We have with us our reference personality, our source of inspiration, Professor uh, Appadurai. Uh, Professor Arjun Appadurai does not need any introduction at all. We read his work, we get inspired from his work, from his journey of enriching social theory building in India and abroad. He is currently nurturing as anthropologist at New York University and a leading voice in global anthropology and social anthropology. Um, Today, we have invited to share his understanding about agricultural unrest and capitalism. Uh, Professor Appadurai is one of the most influential thinkers of our time and whose theorizations have been central to our understanding of globalization and modernity. Uh, he articulates very different kind of uh, theory building, and his articulations on social lives of objects have been critical and crucial in our study of textual understanding of social reality. Um, he has shaped our understanding, he nurtured our understanding, and he flourished our understanding of globalization, culture, and social dynamics. Uh, so thank you, sir, for accepting our invitation. And I request you to please share your presentation. Thank you so much.
As you probably know, this event was organized at the initiative of Ananta, Giri, because I have published a book recently. So this was seen as a kind of occasion to discuss that book. And the book is on what I call agricultural reason. And I will say some words about it. That will be the main content of my 30 minutes or so. Will be a kind of journey through and about the book. I will try not to attempt a detailed summary, because that would be not, I think, the purpose of such an occasion. And also because I want to keep to my time so that I can hear Professor Mohanty, plus I think another discussant was also planned, Professor Hira Singh, but I don't know whether he's here. But in any case, Professor Mohanty is here and others are here, as you explained, also coming through other media, etc. So I want to hear those voices. But of course, not all of you may have had a chance to see the book or read it, although I should say that it is available cost-free. It is an open source book. You just have to look for my name, Arjun Appadurai, and How Books, which is distributed by University of Chicago, but it's a separate imprint. And if you look up those keywords, you will immediately see this book called Agricultural Reason. It is open source. You can download it. You can read it. So if you have not done so already, I hope you will do so at some point if your interests take you there. So today I want to speak for about 30 minutes, as I said, as suggested by Anand, and make a journey at least through some aspects of the book that I think are of potential interest today. And I say potential interest today because the book is a collection of essays written largely in the 1980s. And it is therefore a return to public light of fieldwork done in 1981-82. So in many ways, you might say it's a historical document of a very particular place at a particular time. and also a very particular point of view and stage in my own career and development, which is now, that is to say, roughly speaking, you could say the work in the book is about 40 years ago. So you may well ask, why should we be bothering with some dusty work done 40 years ago? I hope I can persuade you that it's worth doing. And some of what I say will be to show why I sought some opportunity to publish this work, because these essays and a few others appeared in fairly specialized places. And the truth is that even some people who know me and know my work quite well have no idea that I actually spent some time in a rural place and wrote about agriculture. So the number of people who know that is rather small. At most, they may have seen one essay here or there, but I don't think they know that I made a fairly substantial investment in this topic long ago. And now the question is, what can we find of that which is still of relevance or of value? So the remarkable fact of rural India is that all roads lead not to Rome, but to a state of affairs which is characterized by high levels of discrimination towards untouchable, or as we say, Dalit castes, persistent bias against women, high levels of agrarian poverty, and a striking persistence of small holdings and quasi-feudal political structures. Almost 50% of India's total population consists of small farmers and their families. And 85% of all farms are smaller than 2 square hectares. By the way, for many people in Europe and US, even elsewhere in Asia and Africa, this would be a stunning fact in itself, that 85% of the small farms are smaller than 2 square hectares. Almost all the other indicators of welfare and well-being in rural India reflect these dismal statistics. This overall picture of limited productivity, small holdings, and minimal mechanization of farming is all the more striking because of its relative imperviousness to change. In dry villages like the one that I studied, to which I gave the pseudonym Wadi, it's about 25 kilometers south east of Pune, in Purandar Taluk, for those who know that area. In dry villages like Wadi, things have not changed that much since 1981-82, except for the disturbing and deeper inroads of state-subsidized capitalism, which is true everywhere. And remember, this is very close to Pune, so it's an area very much in the hands of the sugar and sugarcane elites of Maharashtra. It is not a remote place. It is not like, let us say, Bid or Vidarbha. It is a very cosmopolitan area. So it has been penetrated by many, many such capitalist forces. So I want to now also remind you, of course, that India was not always a land of isolated, static, and self-sufficient villages. But many changes in the 18th and 19th centuries, both ideological and infrastructural, pushed India's agrarian world into a sort of isolation and economic inertia, which was not a part of their longer history. Britain's colonial rule, which was, of course, involved hundreds of thousands of Indians also, that rule was the reason for this delinking of India's villages from larger world economies, except as producers of cheap agricultural commodities and of an urban class of informal, precarious, and exploited labor. So Indian urban histories, like that of Mumbai's brief period of industrial glory in the period from, let's say, 1930 to 1980, which created something like a serious urban working class with secure jobs, housing, and unions, represents a relatively short moment in Indian history when the economic isolation of Indian villages was compensated by real urban possibilities. When I was doing my fieldwork in 1981-82, many of the men in my village were actually working in Bombay factories. And suddenly they were back sitting around in the village. And I only had a dim idea that something big was going on in Bombay, namely the textile strike, which then changed Bombay's history and in some way India's history ever since. But I was only dimly aware because I was focused on this very small place. And I want to now add that in the long as well as the short history of places like this village that I studied, India's villages overall are the targets of two less than benign forces, the state and the urban capitalist sector, which are in fact closely connected. And I here refer to the relatively recent work within the last decade or even less of people like Jamie Cross, who teaches at Edinburgh, Michael Levine, Johns Hopkins, and Sai Balakrishnan, now at Berkeley. All have offered a compelling picture of the aggressive entry of urban and global commercial interests into agrarian land markets through such devices as special economic zones and development corridors, exemptions and licenses enabled by the state. Now, I could say a lot more about this based on their work, but the short way that I want to put it is to use Michael Levine's phrase, broker state. That is, the state, unlike the Nehruvian state, which actually built dams or built other enterprises in the rural areas, this state, recent state of the last 10 years particularly, is a broker state which simply makes land available. In other words, it simplifies the job of getting agrarian land, especially in these corridors, say between Bombay and Pune, or outside, or in Rajasthan, or in the Delhi area. This state overall, India-wide, and this may have begun before, by the way, BJP, already with the previous Congress regime, became a kind of facilitator to provide the land without having huge struggles with entrenched local people. So that was the job of the state. And then what gets done there could be real estate, it could be malls, it could be universities, it could be all kinds of things. And it is. So this is a very massive force everywhere, but it is also true in the area which I studied. So let me quickly just say where I have come so far is to say that we have a paradoxical picture in places like the villages that I studied, and it's not unusual in India because of the overall numbers which I presented, which is that farm holdings are relatively small, technology is relatively limited, inequality is quite high, and at the same time, these places are all very much caught up in a larger capitalist economy, which is both national and international through all kinds of forces. So in a way, it's a lose-lose game where traditional agricultural assets, capacities, etc., have not grown significantly. At the same time, there is a deep penetration of outside, let's say, capitalist forces in terms of commercialization, markets for agrarian goods, attractions for people to leave for labor. So in all those ways, capitalism arrived, but it is not, as it were, that it's a shot in the arm to agricultural productivity or against inequality or for gender or for Dalit rights or anything else. That remains that's why I use the word subsistence. So it's still a kind of survival world in spite of being heavily encompassed in all sorts of capitalist forces. So why do I use the word agricultural reason? as the first part of my title. So I use this term to capture the fact that farmers in India, now this is based on my fieldwork, and you can always tell me whether it's similar or dissimilar elsewhere. I have a feeling it's fairly similar, operate with their own form of reason.
Muted again. It's unmuted, but I can't hear.
Oh, acha, 1 minute.
Now it's unmuted. Here.
My audio is on.
Yes, we can hear you, Arjun. Maybe Professor
Giri.
Singh.
I said,
Welcome, Professor.
I heard somebody say we
Yeah.
can't hear you. I don't know. So I'm just going to continue.
Please. Yeah.
If you can hear me, I'll
Yes.
continue. I see no problem at my side. So, what I mean by this, by reason, is I mean that they have clear ideas about means and ends, causes and effects, certainties and likelihoods. In this sense, agricultural reason is like all reason and expresses itself in rules and tools of thought of varying styles and expressions, whose shared purpose is to allow human beings to get from today to tomorrow. Now, in the 70s, in certain parts of anthropology, there was a tendency to overstate the difference between cultural and practical reason. In other words, to say that practical reason was some kind of Western bourgeois capitalist thing, people calculating, etc., and others had very different cultural forms of reasoning. Now, and I want to show that this is a overdrawn distinction, that all forms of reason have certain peculiarities, but that the peculiarities of reason in worlds like Maharashtrian rural world that I'm talking about have not been paid enough attention. Other forms have been not only paid a lot of attention, but taken for granted as a kind of default thing. And I want to say there is nothing default about agricultural reason. It has to be examined ethnographically. So my interest in agricultural reason is that as a calculative mode, which is culturally embedded and articulate, it is still barely visible in studies of Indian villages, regardless of discipline, and honestly, regardless of timeline. Up to 2024, if you ask the question, though in India we have thousands of excellent studies of agrarian structure, system, and so on, if you ask, how do these people think about X and Y and Z? There is extremely little, strikingly little. So I'm trying to address that question of what, let's say in the French style, you could call peasant mentality. What does it mean to say mentality, which is not making these people exotic, orientalizing them, or saying they're just like us. They're just a little poorer and a little bit oppressed, but otherwise they're just like, somebody in Iowa or somebody in Japan. I, as an anthropologist, am always suspicious when somebody says things like that. So they're just like us, just some details, small details differences. So I want to show the differences are significant. But I now want to also say briefly, before I give a little bit of the content of what I want to say, where I have two main points to make. Just want to make sure I don't lose track of the clock. Yeah, about 15 minutes left is plenty. That I did this fieldwork in 1981-82. And what drove me there is that I was already teaching in the USA. And had been teaching for 5-6 years, had been in graduate school before that. And I was teaching courses on South Asia, as we used to call it then and even now. And therefore, it meant teaching anthropological matters, religion, kinship, caste, jajmani, etc., to students at all levels. And I suddenly realized a bit scandalous because I have never seen a rural place except through a train window or by meeting people who came to Bombay to work, who came from a village and who suddenly would say, I have to go back because of something. Essentially, I had no idea of 80 to 90% of the Indian population, Indian life. So I realized it's a bit of a scandal to be teaching anthropology of India and to be more or less innocent of what happens in rural India. But then I discovered a second scandal. The second scandal is that I was not alone. That everybody who did anthropology, unless you looked very carefully inside the books, you wouldn't know that they are talking about farmers. You would think they are talking about, people who are doing rituals, have jajmani relations, sharing something, marrying here, doing this, doing that. And then somewhere here and there you realize they are also farmers. The truth, of course, is they were mainly farmers. And there were exceptions, people like the great M.N. Srinivas, etc., who gave a lot of information on agriculture and then wrote about other things. But it's a scandalously small number in anthropology. And let me add, at the risk of being provocative, up to today, if you say, what are people growing in this place? What are all the crops in this village in Haryana? What is the seasonal cycle? Who is selling where? Even there, the people doing the study are studying small towns, markets, this, that. But by the time you get to the village, the crowd is very thin. It becomes something else. Some other topic takes over. So, at the same time, if you look at a huge field of economists, agrarian economists, political economy people, they certainly cannot be accused of not studying what's happening in villages or in agriculture. But the question of the cultural side of mentality and all is almost absent. So everybody, does very thorough studies. And I'm thinking now, people I met and encountered in my research year were people at the Gokhale Institute working with Dandekar and Rath, or people at ICRASAT in Hyderabad, or people like Pranab Pradhan and Rudra working on tenancy. So I knew it was not that villages were unknown to Indian scholars, but my field, anthropology, was very weak on it. And at the other side, had a kind of general external framework already, whether it was a class framework or agrarian technology framework or a development framework. There was not much interest in the mentality or worldview of the people in question as farmers. There was interest because they did jajmani, this, that. But if you said, how do they think about their actual farming life from a cultural point of view? I would say a bit limited. So overall, and then of course with history, with historians who have done great work on rural India for decades, the sources don't let you do that because they are British sources. So what are you going to get from Board of Revenue in Tirunelveli in 1825? You're not going to get a close look at the rural mentality of rice cultivators in Tirunelveli. You're going to get something else. Having to do with revenue, with taxes, land holding, etc. So,
Okay.
sorry, have I disappeared from the screen? There.
No.
No,
You
not
are-
at all. Please go ahead.
Yes. So, I wanted to do something about this. And partly because I was already in an academic career, I thought nobody wants to hear the 150th study of some other anthropological topic, let's say rank. Now, late in my life, as some of you know, I have returned to all that. But at that time, I thought, who wants to hear my view on something where there are 10,000 studies from Kashmir to Kanyakumari? So I thought agriculture, well, that's a big topic. No anthropology at all. Let me dive in. So I went in to study. I thought, let me do something on agriculture. And there were distinguished pointers in that direction. Andre Bete, Joan Mencher, Kathleen Goff, not hundreds of people, but some important people who said, look, agriculture is important to study. Andre Bete had an edited book, if I'm not mistaken, called Social Frameworks of Agriculture from the late 70s, early 80s, saying we need, but who listened? After that, we have 10,000 studies coming out of his own department of other things, but you don't have a host of studies. Of course, you had also the great Bhaviskar who wrote on cooperatives. Even he was not that interested in my kind of linguistic cultural stuff. But in any case, that number was small. There are exceptions, of course, here and there, but the number is overall small. So I went there with this interest. And because I was in the US and was exposed to some, let's say, fancy kind of theories about decision making, calculation, peasant reason, this, that. I went there thinking I would do something like that, peasant decision making. And there is some whole literature there, which is now residing calmly in some cemetery, but at that time was very active. And I went, and after a little while, I decided this is going to go nowhere, because the people that I was talking to, that is men and women in this village, really could not give me a clear picture why they decided to do something. So why did you decide not to cultivate onions last year? Well, it's a straightforward decision-making question, but nobody remembers clearly. Also because it's not because they're mentally limited, it's because there are many variables and they can't recollect all that. And I found that in every important area. So I decided, forget this idea of finding out something about cognitive processing, lay reasoning, algorithms, this, that, forget it. So I had to go somewhere else. And this set of essays is about what that somewhere else led me to. And it led me to study how they talked about measurement, about which I'll say a word in a minute, or how they built and organized open surface wells, of which there were 90, which were shared by groups from 10 to 20 households, very detailed water sharing system, some of which were electrified, had pumps, some of which were just open surface dug wells. So wells were a big thing. I wrote about that. Diet was a huge place where women played a very important role in what to eat, what to feed guests, what to feed the family, and in consumption. And that is where, by the way, I learned all sorts of things about measurement. When, for example, I would ask, so how much did you grow last year? A typical straightforward empirical question. How much did you grow? Answer, enough. See? So enough is not something out of which you can build a very sophisticated model. So you have to understand what is being said to you when that is said. And that would happen hundreds of times to me when I was asking this type of question, trying to find out about household consumption, all these topics which others were also interested in. So I thought, let me ask. The answers would sometimes be not so easy to process. But I also wrote about technological change, the arrival of new forms of irrigation, new forms of power, new forms of market, and also historically the entry of ideas of profit, capitalist ideas of enterprise, etc., even in this very modest and largely small farmer setting. So these essays touch on a variety of topics, some of which are fairly abstract. I wrote one on the relation between small-scale and large-scale studies in a dialogue with Pradhan, Srinivasan, Rudra, and so on, saying, we have to be more aggressive to say, how can we connect those? Because otherwise we have highly aggregated studies like National Sample Survey, and then we have people like me, one village, one point in time. It's a conversation, which never happens. So the essays touch on all this. But I do want to say two things before winding up. Two things emerged for me, particularly striking. One is the subject of one of the long chapters in the book, which was never published really previously. So it was the first thing I wrote when I was in Maharashtra in 81, 82, but the last thing that appeared in print somewhere 2-3 years ago. And it's on measurement, and it is called Andaz. Why? Because I would often be told when I asked a measurement question, how much do you need for this? The answer was, we need this much. And then the suffix andaza or andaze was used, which had entered Marathi from Persian. So that led me to discover that Marathi is loaded with Persian. So if you open Molesworth's dictionary of Marathi, which is a brilliant text, you will see how much Persian is there. It's a huge amount. So the irony that today, the Maharashtrian right, Shiv Sena, this, that, are trying to bleed out all this stuff is very difficult, because every other sentence has a Persianate element in Marathi language. You can't remove that easily. So Andaz is the title of this essay, and it's about measurement. And I go to great length to show the importance, for example, of hyphenated measures. How many children do you have? 7, 8 asle, 7, 8, 10, 12, 20, 20, and it's not random. It's used in certain ways. So what is going on here? So I refer to this as a language of ranges, not of numbers. So you have to pay attention because everything is spoken about in terms of ranges because ranges make sense. Nobody is interested, is it 18 or 21, not 18, 20, etc. The other small example I'll give you is that all measurement is negotiated. So you'll be sitting in a room and say, how old is this gentleman here? And he would say, well, I'm 41. And everybody will say, what do you mean 41? You're barely 35, etc. There'll be a long discussion and then there'll be a consensus. Yeah, he's probably 39, maybe. So very few measures were seen as context-free, absolute, precise. So I spend a lot of time in this chapter trying to talk about what that means. And of course, it's very important that because it affects what you grow, it affects what you spend on marriages, it affects how you cook, it affects what you borrow. Nothing is free of this world of measure. So andaz is something that I think you will find in this book, on which there is really very little elsewhere. That's why I say I have resuscitated artificially, given respiration to this work of 40 years ago, because there are things in it which I think have not changed, have not gone away. They don't change that fast. The final thing to say is what I discovered overall about this world of subsistence in the shadow of capitalism, because people went to work in Pune, went to work in Bombay, sold their vegetables in Pune, Bombay, and elsewhere. So they were deeply embedded, but barely making ends meet. This is the joke. It's like running to stay in place, selling, borrowing, loans for this, loans for that. So cash is everywhere. But are you better off at the end of the day? Do you have less people who are hungry, less people who are starving, less? No. So the closing comment is there is a value, I believe, in the sense of a norm, which I saw everywhere in arrangements from, let's say, sharing of bullocks for plowing between people who owned bullocks and people who didn't own bullocks. So the people who owned them, of course, had more power, but the people who didn't own them also had a kind of claim, and there was a name for it, which is also not known 3 villages away. That's how micro the terminology is. So whether it's bullock sharing, whether it's other forms of labor, whether it's pooling energies for ritual processes, whether it's sharing in the water of an open surface well among 30, 40, there is a deep tension surrounding cooperation versus autonomy. And there is a big push towards what you may call relationality. So if you want to say what is driving people, it is somehow being in what you can call sociality or relationality. It's a driving value. So although there may be big pushes to be autonomous, because that's the nature of commercialization, your profit, your money, your land, your labor, your wages, but there is a push towards relationality, not exactly reciprocity, which suggests some happy, republic. This is not that, but you need people. And my last comment would be, because I have begun recently, and some people like my colleague Amrit know this, I'm working on caste now again, trying to understand it better, that in a way, while some parts of the system of caste, especially purity, pollution, and so on, are pushing you apart, there is something about agriculture, because of its desperately uneven, unequal, limited quality, which pulls you together. You cannot afford to pull apart. So there is some interesting dynamic there between the subject that I have not mentioned up to now, caste, and what you might call agriculture, rural mentality, agrarian reason. Agrarian reason plays out in a manner that optimizes some kind of relationality. Whereas you might say caste in a certain way pushes you apart. And this relationality is not judgment. It's a lot of other things. It is not a simple Jajmani relation. So let me stop there. More could be said, but I thank you for your patience and I look forward to Professor Mohanty's comments and any other questions or issues.
Professor Giri, shall I
Yes,
speak?
thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Ananta, you were shrouded in darkness, but now you are shining with light, as you always are.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Cannot hear.
Please unmute yourself. Professor Giri, please
Professor
unmute.
Professor Mohanty, please continue. Thank you, Arjun. And Professor Mohanty. After Professor Mohanty, Professor Hira Singh, please.
Okay, thank you. So at the outset, actually, I'm thankful to Professor Ananta Giri for organizing this event and making me a part of this event and giving an opportunity to here to share my comments and ideas about this new wonderful book which Professor Appadurai has brought out. And I will speak. My presentation will have two parts. In the first part, I will very briefly highlight what the book says, and in the second part, I will share some of my comments and I will seek some clarifications from Appadurai. And as you know that it is always a pleasure to listen to Professor Appadurai and also read his work. I enjoyed reading this book as well as many of his other publications. So now the book actually which is in question, Agricultural Region in the Shadow of Subsistence Capitalism, as Professor Appadurai has already indicated, this book presents 5 different essays which are published previously along with a kind of a new introduction. It is indeed refreshing to read all these essays together in the background of its introduction, which is very interesting, which he has already highlighted now. And also this introduction provides a kind of new perspective, new meaning to all these chapters. And gives a kind of new kind of connections among these chapters. And analysis in all the chapters is based on the data collected, as Professor Appadurai mentioned, in the early 1980s from a village called Wadi in Pune district of Maharashtra, Western Maharashtra. Precisely, actually, the book demonstrates the importance of cultural analysis for understanding the agrarian world. It explains the process of a negotiation of subsistence rural agrarian economy with the conditions of capitalism within the broader framework of relationality and sociality. The book actually begins with a chapter titled Andaz, which just he mentioned. Andaz is a kind of Marathi word which signifies, also it's a Hindi word which signifies approximation. In this chapter, actually, Professor Appadurai tries to expose rather actually the static character of Western modernity's fixation with the notion of accurate measurement. It is argued in the book, in this chapter, that measurement is a cultural phenomenon and it has to be interpreted in the cultural context. Contrary to the idea that measurement is precise, context-free and universal. So he negates and challenges this Western idea that measurement is context-free, precise and universal. And in the subsequent chapter, he goes on to address some of the methodological problems involved in the large-scale surveys as well as micro sociological and anthropological studies, and tries to explore the ways how to coordinate among the various methods, particularly relating to distributional and relational measures. And thereafter, actually, in the next chapter, he describes the social arrangements revolving around the access of water from open surface wells, highlighting the conditions of cooperation among the small producers, small farmers. And the next chapter deals with the relationship between gender, consumption, and production among the small farming households. And with the focus, actually, the chapter talks more about the women. And the last chapter actually analyzes the relationship between technological changes and the domain of the values. All the chapters in the book underline the importance of the force of sociality and relationality. This is the kind of commonality of all the chapters, and also to some extent reciprocity that encompasses cooperation and a kind of organic solidarity, which also he mentioned somewhere. And to Professor Appadurai, the agricultural rationality is a kind of a counterpoint to the inner logic of caste, which is based on difference, repulsion, and distance. Caste divides, whereas actually relationality brings together the different groups of producers and different segment of the population. Stated precisely, the book shows how everyday activities of farmers in the sphere of production, distribution, consumption generate concepts and theory of relationality. Overall, to my understanding or to me, the book provides a new perspective to understand the process of rural economic change. It is conceptually engaging, methodologically innovative, and theoretically sensitive, with a strong empirical foundation. So now, this is the kind of the account the book provides. I wanted to present first. Then I will shift to the second part of my presentation, which actually where I will try to tell about my comments, and I will also present something which requires further clarification from Professor Appadurai. Hopefully, it will make some sense. As I have told you, that book in the book, Professor Appadurai gives overemphasis on relationality and gives actually or undermines the importance of the structure of inequalities in understanding this agrarian world. And to my knowledge or to my understanding, it is inequality or differentiation in terms of whether caste, class, or gender that forms the basis for this relationality. And relationality can be explained only with reference to this inequality, because that represents the structural characteristics of the society. It talks about the structure of the society, and relationality is a kind of consequence, is a structural consequence. So point is that actually we also need to begin from the structural kind of elements to proceed further to the consequences. Because the relationship between landless and landowners, or large landowners and the landless laborers, higher caste and lower caste, men and women, all these things actually it involves inequality. And if you want to understand the relationality, we need to know the structure of inequalities. Then the second problem what I observe is relating to distributional and relational dimensions of the rural life. And Professor Appadurai mentions that social life is constituted by a series of small-scale interactions in which large-scale factors are embedded. It is true, but in a kind of large country or large kind of society like India, which has a kind of regional diversity and regional disparities, and where different communities are different level of economic development, how to make this kind of how to study this kind of small scale interactions to arrive at a kind of macro level generalizations. When we start a kind of any research, we look at the first NSS data or census data and try to actually make some meaning and then go to the micro level situation to try to draw how these attributional kind of things are actually making a sense to understand the interactional dimensions. That is what I understand. So I think I am puzzled actually how this how to coordinate, how to kind of commensurate actually this relational and kind of a distributional kind of things are quite challenging things. And any research has a kind of time-bound kind of things and limited budget, and the kind of ways and means Professor Appadurai has suggested to coordinate these things. It's a quite complex and quite challenging. And how to handle this thing, that's also, it's not so easy to my understanding. Then the third problem is relating to the problem of measurement. You know, he says that measurement is social process, and it is culturally embedded, and it involves negotiation. It involves negotiation. Point is that actually our society is not a kind of a really equal, based on equality, homogeneous society. It's a tremendous inequality. And if the negotiation is taking place, who is the gainer and loser of this negotiation? And when this Western kind of the essence of capitalism, the basis of capitalism rests on precise, universal, and kind of approximation. It's a kind of a measurement, very accurate measurement. It cannot go with kind of the contextual kind of measurement. So in that case, actually, when inequality, the farmers or the producers, those who have better knowledge of this, the Western mode of measurements, naturally they will be a kind of an advantageous position. And in such a case, may not lead to a kind of cooperative kind of things. Relationality may not lead to cooperative kind of things. It may end up with exploitative kind of things in the absence of this knowledge. For example, a moneylender he will not go by this approximate kind of values or approximation of the cultural kind of things. So naturally, he will expect a kind of accurate things. And if the money, the peasant who is borrowing money is unaware of these things, he may be exploited. So in the absence of these things, so it may create a lot of kind of complex situations how to handle such kind of things. I am just giving some indications. There may be many more such kind of instances. Then the next kind of thing which is also related, you know, the entire analysis of all the chapters is based on a kind of single village which has 193 households. But the focus of all the chapters is mostly on this one caste, that is Maratha caste, which constitutes 174 households, and also only small producers who are the landowners of less than 5 acres of land. The book tells less about the other caste, particularly the lower caste and the untouchables, and also tells less about the large landowners. And though there is only one large landholder who has more than 25 acres of irrigated land, but we do not know much about his activities and his enterprising kind of things, how this relational things is acting with regard to that capitalist farmer or that large holder. We are not getting that picture. Then, you know, these small producers, those who are going for a kind of relational kind of things and have a which are actually following a kind of subsistence capitalism. And the point actually, when the capitalism advances or remains at a kind of initial stage, it naturally creates a kind of conditions which may be difficult for the small producers and difficult for them to cope up. And these small producers, probably because of a kind of bounded solidarity, because of the bounded situation, they have pushed to a kind of a relational kind of things that to overcome or to cope up with these kind of requirements of capitalism. This may be a kind of a temporary kind of arrangement to see, and in course of when the capitalism matures, it may have a kind of either way, either they have to go to this side or that side. What actually Marx predicted or the subsequent Marxist scholars they have argued. Then the relationality, how it is working with reference to the local power structure with reference to cooperatives and panchayats. You know, this is the kind of a crucial kind of aspect where actually state plays a kind of major role, because in up to 1980s, cooperative was a kind of a major kind of agency through which state-sponsored measures, inputs, subsidies actually were channelized to these farmers. And it is actually it will be interesting to know how this relationality is working and how this cooperation is actually cooperative kind of things is actually is running through this power structure. That is actually important. And I think some of these points actually I wanted to tell. And one more thing, that the book has a kind of interesting introduction, but I think it would have been actually beneficial if it would have a kind of conclusion. So I was expecting to read the concluding part of the book, where is the conclusion, but abruptly it ended. And in some cases also, when the published papers are reproduced, we try to also avoid some of the repetitive kinds of things. Actually, in many chapters, the repetitive description about the village, it is there actually. So it could have been actually put in a kind of introduction section to make the book actually more coherent. I think I will not extend further. I have crossed the time limit, so I will stop here. But I must tell you, it is a kind of very good contribution. I enjoyed reading the book, and it is a kind of important contribution to the field of agrarian studies. And I am sure this book will contribute immensely to the ongoing debate on agrarian studies on various issues, particularly relating to the debate on the relationship between capitalism and peasantry and persistence and disappearance of peasantry. Thank you so much. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mohanty, for your deep insights. So now Professor Hira Singh, please. Professor Singh teaches sociology at York University, Toronto. Professor Singh, please.
Am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, please. Yes.
Okay. In the first place, Professor Giri, many thanks. And I should say, should I thank you, or really I felt kind of compelled when you asked me, because I could say no to a colleague of mine, but I couldn't say no to a former student of mine. And I have had very long, very deep relations with you. And whenever you ask me to do something, I feel almost compelled to say yes. Anyway,
Can I just ask if I can see Professor Singh?
Oh, you could see me, but that will need little bit of more preparation, because
No worries. It's
I
okay.
also want to see him. Yes.
this is
No
time
worries.
for me to be in bed, actually. So I'm almost
I
in bed.
understand.
I'm
No
talking
worries.
to you.
No
Okay,
problem.
but I promise you will see me. I'll see you, but I can see you at least virtually, But I've been reading about you, hearing about you, and I'm very fascinated with what you have written. But I also have some kind of, in the first place, to begin with, it's like you have written few lines about Marx, what he thought of Indian village and Indian agrarian relations, all those things. And it always reminds me like Athato Brahma Jigyasa, like you always start with what is Brahma, what is this thing, and what is the ultimate truth. So Marx is always cited on Indian studies for saying something which is so distorted, so skewed, so messed up, that I'm always amused with that. And if you read Marx's writings on India, and particularly on agrarian relations, is spread through Marx's various volumes, including Capital, Marx is writing something very sensible, something historical and structural, and that's where I want to start. Your logic of culture, or your cultural logic, it's so divorced from structural logic. And here, Professor Appadurai, we in sociology, we start with not with culture in isolation from structure, but how culture and structure are embedded. And if you want to understand the relationship between structure and culture, it raises the single most important question is how to go about it. And there, sir, there is a huge difference between mainstream sociology and Marxism. But Indian sociologists start by saying that Marx did not understand India, Marx did not understand Indian culture. But here is my intervention, that unfortunately for sociologists and anthropologists, the only way to understand India, again, Marxism is not something which is applicable to the West and it is not applicable to the East. It's not a weather report that, it is applicable to the hilly regions but not applicable to the desert. Marxism is a method to study society, any society, including Indian society, and that method is that when you go to study agrarian relations in India, you have to understand, most importantly, the social relations of production in agriculture. And there is a huge debate on that, at least in agriculture. That in the early 70s and all that, they talked about development of capitalism in Indian agriculture. But long before that, you see Arya Sharma, you see Romila Thapar. Before that, other historians who have taken a Marxist approach, they talk about agrarian relations, what are social relations of production in agriculture, which is to start with land, who controls the land, who cultivates the land, that relationship, and how that relationship has not been static, but it has been changing, going back from Vedic period to the period of the epics to the period, then post-epic period, and then various dynasties and rules just before the British, and then coming to the British and intervention in agrarian relations. Whether it is understanding Mauryan Empire, or it is understanding colonial India, or understanding modern India, the problem is the same and methodology is the same, that you have to understand the centrality of social relations of production, and the agricultural culture is not divorced from those social relations of production. That's my comment number one, that study of culture always runs in the skies. It never touches the earth, but to touch the earth, culture must be related to social relations of production. That's my comment number one. Some of the other things you were actually talking about, what peasant did not know and know, it reminded me of something. When I was in India, I used to read Film Fair very regularly, and one of the comments I read there, that a villager wanted to see a film which was shot in his village, and he saw the whole film, he could not find his village there. So which is what anthropologists and particularly those who are high caliber anthropologists, when they talk about agrarian relations and people who live in agrarian relations are usually missing, and that's again the part of the faulty framework with which they go and study it. So I don't know if I should say any more, but I have some serious problems with the basic framework and basic assumptions with which the book starts and it ends. So again, I'll only say that to understand Indian peasant, it's extremely important to bring in the structural questions and the historical dimension. What is utterly disappointing in Indian studies for me is this whole question of 3,000, 4,000 years history is summed up in 5 sentences, 6 sentences, or 600 pages, but the problem remains the same. The question of structure and history. and what is the meaning of a structure, and that relationship between structure, culture, and history, which cannot be understood, cannot even be started without defining the framework. And again, I want to emphasize this thing, even if it sounds a little bit repetitive, that the real problem in sociological studies or so-called sociological studies in India, which focus on peasantry, which do focus on rural India, is that their theoretical framework, their basic assumptions, and most importantly, the very conceptual framework. Mainstream sociology does not have even the basic concepts to understand any relations. What they call social relations, that's my last point, that social relations in sociology, which studied and does all these things, and their concept of social is anything but social, simply because social in sociology is not economic, it's not political, it's social. So a social which is not economic and political is anything but social. And I end there, and we can keep on talking about caste. Just one word about caste. That again, understanding of caste is nothing, sir, but social relations of production. You cannot understand caste in isolation from the process of production. Process of production is the process of who controls the land, who owns the land, who labors on land. In other words, the same framework in which the structure and culture are directly related. And to start with that, again, you have to go to the same scheme. Egalitarian relations, feudal relations of production, end of feudal relations of production, and introduction of capitalist relations of production. For instance, you are studying capitalist relations of production. How old are capitalist relations of production? If you understand 3,000 years of Indian history, when did capitalist relations evolve? How did they come into being? Those are all serious questions of studying agrarian relations sociologically. But if I go to a village and talk to a villager and come back with the study of andaz or some measurement or something, and andaz is, I think, a Urdu or Persian term, and if you really see the revenue records and land records of any village in India, you will find all kinds of words being used. They are local words, local customs. And sir, if one thing that peasant knew very well, knew the agricultural cycle, knew the measurement, knew the meaning of who is who in agrarian relations. But I think when anthropologists, sociologists who are highly educated, who have not lived in the village, were not born in the village, have never seen a peasant, when they go to study, probably they end up doing something else rather than talking to a real peasant and reading and doing real agrarian relations and peasant society or something. Anyway, sorry, I think I'm being too unreasonable and taking too much time. So I'll stop, and maybe if there is some question later on, I'll talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Singh, for so lovely for warming up our modes of conviviality. So, Professor Appadurai, would you like to share your response now, or look forward to a few more thoughts? Maybe you would like to share.
Maybe I can say. Yeah. Maybe I can say a few words now, but I would certainly also like to hear from others. So I don't want to give a second bhashan. When I'm allowed one bhashan, we cannot take two bhashans. Still, a few things should be said. And in the spirit of humor, I will say I'm glad that I am 75, because after Professor Singh's commentary, I would have to conclude my career, but it is concluding anyway. So the fact that it is on a wrong train from the beginning, and we have now arrived in Raniganj, because the train is ending, I am not so worried. If I was 30 years old, 40 years old, I would be very worried and I would have to change everything about my point of view. So that is my little joke that it's good to be at this stage. The second comment I'll make, and then I will go to Professor Mohanty, who is a kind of raised a very gentle and courteous version of Professor Singh's rather more forceful comments. So,
Discourteous.
but there is a difference, of course. So let me separate my reactions a little bit. Yes, to Professor Singh, everything has to do with the framework. Everything has to do with 3,000 years. But I flatly disagree with your fundamentalism, your Marxist fundamentalism. I have nothing against
yeah,
Marx.
okay.
I have nothing against Marx, but I don't like when there is one formulation, social relations of production, which is supposed to be the key to 3,000 years of Indian history. By the way, I have read
Oh, sure.
a ton of stuff
Oh, yeah.
on agrarian relations, going back to Irfan Habib, Kosambi, this one, that one. People who have written about the Vedic period and Mughal period and Rajwari system and peasantry. I know this literature. So I'm not descending from heaven, sent by some anthropological god to land in a village in Maharashtra and suddenly talk to individual peasants. Talking to peasants are not going to give your theory either. Whatever they say, they're not going to say, look, the first thing is social relations of. So let us just agree to disagree. Because the disagreement is so fundamental that we can't take it up here. You would have to change your entire intellectual history and positions, or I would have to do mine, and I'm not doing that. So the book is a modest effort to say something about something. That does not mean I'm trying to explain the entire agrarian world of India for 3,000 years, or even for 100 years. But I'm coming from a certain point of view, and it is incompatible with your way of thinking. Let us leave it there. Secondly, now, Professor Mohanty, I think yours are much more, to me, discussable, debatable, and all in a constructive way, because actually I agree with much of what you say, that the inequality problem is very basic. The village I studied has a peculiar profile, meaning massively Maratha and massively small farmers. Still, it is true that this tiny handful of untouchables who are really excluded and very rich farmers could have been paid more attention. But as you know, even when you're doing national sample survey, some outliers tend to disappear. Nobody can take everything into account. And if you want to say something interesting, you have to pick something. But still, I agree that in a fuller context, one could say more about physics. I think on the question of inequality, there's a very deep debate to be had about what is driving and what is an expression or consequence. So in my field, let us say, when you, generally speaking, take culture seriously, and take culture seriously as a systematic worldview, not as a matter of customs and making food and, celebrating this and that, but as a really systematic thing, as systematic as anything else. The question, what is precursory to what, is tough. And one has to make some, and you said throughout that some of these things are very methodologically tricky. And I'll make only one comment on that, though I really would love to see your comments in written form so I can go through them carefully, but and use them for improving my own thinking. That when you talk about this interactional reality at the micro level, and what do we do with it? The truth is, taking the elevator from upstairs to downstairs is equally difficult. In other words, where you start with some big hypothesis and then try to find its expressions here and there, that is also extremely difficult. And in the context where I wrote that paper on small scale and large scale, it was with people from NSS and so on and so forth, all trying to think, how should we do this? And it's a tough problem, but I don't think it's particularly solved by beginning with something macro and then working downwards. I do think there is a way to start at a very interactional, intimate, face-to-face, to use the phrase of someone like Goffman, and then work up. In fact, in that conference, I said to the people from NSS, why don't you go when people go to a ration store or go to a bank and get accepted or rejected? Why not find those events and then sample those events and then aggregate? So the problem is not a downloading, but aggregation. If I show you something small and tell you it's happening in 100 places, then the methodological challenge becomes, how do we aggregate to larger phenomena? So that's from the bottom up. So I guess what I will only say is that there is no intrinsic reason why the small to the big is harder than going from the big to the small. I mean, there are always the same problems, but it's well worthy of discussion. The other thing I would say is it's important. Sometimes that problem of micro and macro, let's say, or small and large scale, is conflated with the problem of cultural and political. So Professor Hira Singh's comments tended to think of cultural things as something somebody may tell you one day in the evening when he's having a cigarette, whereas social relations of production are there in coming, encompassing the whole society from the mud to the sky, everything is encompassed. But other things, cultural things, are little odds and ends here and there. I disagree with that. So I think we should be very careful to separate the problem of cultural assumptions, logics, etc., from, let's say, inequality, which is, of course, a crucial issue, that problem from the small and large scale. Those should be tackled separately. But on the whole, I want to say I take your comments very seriously, because in the end, I am interested in the, let's say, long-term reproduction of inequality. And that is a problem nobody has decisively solved, except to give it a name, calling it this, calling it that. But if you really ask why certain things, for example, Barrington Moore asked this, why in China and Russia were there certain social revolutions, and certainly in Europe, not in India? There is no off-the-shelf answer for this. So I think we all need to have these debates. What is the priority? What is the driving force? What are the effects? What are the short-term effects? And why are certain, now I put it in your terms, certain forms of inequality so stubborn? And that is a variable matter across society. So we have to give an answer. We can't just say in human life, that's the way it is. We have to say why in India, in spite of this, in spite of that, in spite of monetization, there are long histories, this, that, there is a remarkable challenge to change the, let's call it, structural inequality, which produce a vast number of people who are very close to the survival line. That simply seems to be the case. So I think we have a common ground, a shared problem, but some differences about approach. And I think, at least in this book, which is not always my view of everything, but in regard to farming, what I was trying to say is that, and farmers and agriculture, that how they think about quantity, quality, extent, measure, relations has not been paid the same attention as, let's call it, some distributional realities, which are not simple. They are huge, which is why we have a huge literature from political sociology, agrarian sociology, etc. Tremendous. But what I'm saying is one more thing would help. And that is the thing I'm pointing. So let me stop there, because I'm sure there are other questions or comments, but thanks very much.
Thank you, Arjun. So other friends, please. Professor Amrit Srinivasan, please.
Mute.
Professor Srinivasan, please unmute yourself.
I've unmuted.
Very good.
Hi.
He has made sure we all talk and he doesn't. And yeah, we will need to. I found the fact of Arjun, you're mentioning the broker system fascinating, because I think that's where India is going. Everyone's become a dalal. There's even technology is doing dalali, and you have in this small village seen the same thing working itself out. And given brokerage becoming central to inequality too, I think even the so-called rich farmer is also facing precarity, to use a very fashionable term today. But I don't see the farmer who is rich as necessarily in a better off position to, say, the working salaried professor. I would like your position on that, because and I'll end with that. The recent farmers' agitation over the last 2-3 years was at one point almost condemned, that it's only the rich farmers who are participating. We used to hear that. I don't know enough to say I agree or disagree with that, but it was said. And why was it said? That even the rich farmer is protesting like the poor ought to, according to Hira Singh. Some thoughts on that?
Yes. I mean, thank you, Amrit. Anant, I assume I can speak. Shall I respond briefly?
So what I can request that let us gather in this
By
spirit
all
of
means.
Yeah.
in this
By
spirit
all
of
means.
harvesting, gather some more seeds.
Certainly, the harvest may be better.
Lovely. So Professor Srinivas will wait for a few more thoughts. So other friends, please. We have Professor Ranju Hasini Sahu, an anthropologist teaching at Amarkantak. And others who would like to ask, please raise your hand. So Professor Sahu, please.
Good evening, Sir Professor Appadurai. I am so happy to listen all these things and discussions, sir. Is it audible, Anand?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So actually, I was working as an anthropologist, and I was working for the cultural practices, sir. And now, as a professor in sociology, I am giving emphasis upon the structural framework, sir. In this whole debate, whole discussion, I enjoyed a lot, sir, because I want to find out how to make this structure and cultural practices embedded in our theoretical framework, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, all of you. Thank you, Anand. I enjoyed the whole discussion. I will go through the book, sir. I'm yet to go through the books, but I will certainly go through this book. Thank you, sir, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Professor Singh, please. Professor.
Yeah, I'll be very brief again. I think Professor Appadurai was as dismissive of the question I raised as he was in his initial talk. Again, Marxism and of all the people, again, I can just cite Lenin. One of the things that Lenin said, that Marxism is not a key to all questions in human history. So he is exaggerating that. I'm saying that social relations of production open all doors, and nothing could be farthest from truth. It is gross distortion. All I'm saying is that to understand agrarian inequality, there is no alternative to social relations of production. Agrarian inequalities are rooted in social relations of production. And if you know the meaning of social relations of production, it's very simple. It's the question of land ownership, it's the question of property right, production rights, which have been changing, sir. If you go back to the Vedic period, it was a society, it was a pastoralist society. Land was not the main form of property. Even the question when land becomes the main form of property, what is Bhagavad Gita? Bhagavad Gita is nothing but justification of transition of a system from pastoralism to land as the main property, from chiefdom to kingdom. There was no kingdom that time, there was chiefdom, and from chiefdom to kingdom, from kingdom to onwards later on, you can see those relations of production. They keep on changing, form of inequality keeps on changing, form of exploitation, reciprocity, all those fancy words that sociologists use, they have been keeping on changing. It is just simply a matter of method how to study. And all I'm telling you, and I do emphasize that outside Marxism, there is no method to systematically understand agrarian relations, not only in India, but anywhere. And you simply refuse to answer that question because you don't want to engage with Marxism. Marxism is nothing but something to be dismissed, which is
That's
where
not true. That is simply
I stop.
untrue. I have to say that is simply unfair and untrue. I have to
What is
put it
unfair?
like that.
What is unfair and untrue?
That I refuse to deal with Marxism. What it means, I refuse to do it your way. Sorry, I can't continue to be polite with this kind of
No, I
lecturing.
don't want, no, I don't need politeness.
I don't accept this way of speaking. That's it.
Oh, that's separate thing. No, like my way of speaking, that's sorry, I can't change that. I go to a
Nor can
seminar.
I change my way of thinking.
No, that's okay. That's fine. I'm not very keen to talk to you. If that is your answer, I'm least interested in talking to you. And I didn't come here to talk to you. You don't want to hear that, I'm not interested in hearing you either. That's separate matter.
You're muted, Ananta.
Ananta bhai, please
Professor
unmute
Singh.
yourself.
Please.
Professor Singh and Professor Appadurai. So with respect, we move forward. This is a part of our journey. So now other friends, please, other friends seeking question, please. Maybe as you are thinking, let me, any other friend, please?
Yes, sir. Thank you,
Please.
Professor Appadurai. Am I audible? Am I audible to everyone?
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you,
Yes,
Professor
please.
Appadurai,
Audible.
for this wonderful lecture. And we must welcome you because it's been so long an anthropologist of Indian origin to get into the debate on peasantry and agriculture. And my question is, sir, with regard to the measurement, the issue you have brought in, unknowingly you have challenged a kind of, large group of scholars, especially the eminent scholars, those who are working on peasantry and peasant economy. If you remember correctly, the ongoing the debate between Popkin and Scott, where they argued that peasants are cost benefit calculators, and when you argue that they the in the context of andas, they cannot if you ask, you have also mentioned in your book that where your well is located, the peasant is answering that it is other side of the river. And there are some other instances also, you have also examples also you have mentioned. So my question is, sir, especially the peasant you have studied in 1980s, probably they have grown up now. If you see, you cannot survive being a peasant without the market, and you must know that how much you are producing, because market is so interlinked now. Every peasant, they sell their produce in the market, and they know that how much they are entitled to sell in the market, especially in the regulated market, especially in the formal market, and how much they are producing, and how much they have invested, they are well aware of. So how do you see this approach? And the second question, sir, actually while reading this book, I anticipated that you will provide a link about the aspiration and the future aspiration of farming in the context of the agrarian logic, especially the younger generation joining farming, because recently this new debate about generational renewal and warning interest of youth from farming is a kind of emerging area where you have also written a piece on the capacity of Aspire. Actually, I was thinking that probably you will be providing a link between the aspiration and this youth joining the farming. There are two questions, sir. That's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Lenka. Thank you. Minati, do you see any other hand raised, please?
Yeah, Tamanna has raised her hand. Tamanna
Okay.
Khoshla, Dr. Tamanna Khoshla.
Hello,
Hello,
Tamanna,
Professor.
please.
Yes, sir. Hello, Professor. I'm sorry I joined a bit late because of some preoccupations. But my basic understanding is that, I wanted to know from you where agrarian movements or agrarian society can do better. Is it an extreme capitalism like France, America, etc., or is it in countries like China? Or I mean, even India, for example, I mean, which country following any of these maxims would be doing better? So that's what I wanted to ask. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamanna. So to this festivity of thinking together, Arjun and dear friends, I wish to bring a few submissions. First of all, a few deeply, inviting and thoughtful lines from the book, which Arjun elaborated, and it requires continued deep meditation. For example, there is a line in the methodology chapter. We need to be skeptical about interpreting increases in certain aggregate measures. And that is a very profound thinking, because aggregate numbers may rise, number of wells may rise, number of bullocks may rise, but still the condition of life can be precarious. Therefore, it is not just a methodological question. It is also a question about the very condition of living. Regarding, another important line in the book, commercial agriculture employs a large number of small commercial farmers, eking out a precarious subsistence in a highly monetized agrarian economy. And that is also very true of the contemporary agrarian, Indian, and the world conditions. Then another line is microfacts have to be looked at relationally rather than only distributionally. Therefore, to Professor Mohanty's question, and Professor Appadurai has reflected upon it. Therefore, how do we really methodologically create, I would say, niches of learning, the middle range, and either from the micro to the macro. With this, I also draw our attention to Professor Appadurai himself saying that he didn't pay attention to the Dalit life world in the village. And he said that I am city-based, I am an upper caste person. And that is important. But at the same time, as he has acknowledged that it requires now, a kind of attention. And therefore, is it a structural problem like the structural problem of inequality? How is that? Most of these studies of Indian village, Professor Bete's study on the Tanjore village and your own study, why this, structural feature persists, and whether there is any transformation in this modality of exclusion. The second very interesting line in the book, in your chapter on food, you write, the problem of domestic food provision is viewed from a female perspective. And that is a very interesting line. And there you describe the experience of one woman whom you call as S, and a few paragraphs. So that is an invitation for us to link both ethnography and theory. For example, in one place you write that how your work is not a continuation of project of phenomenology. So therefore, phenomenologically as well as anthropologically, as enriching the book is in terms of very deep insights, especially the chapter 2 on method and some theoretical insights, what we miss is more voices. For example, even in measurement, we do not hear much voices, and you yourself write that some critic might suggest that it suffers from a kind of thin actual vignettes. So how do we hear more voices of people? Then moving on, I wish to raise one or two questions quickly, is the whole question of sociality. And you present sociality as a very important way of thinking and entering our life world. But what is our view of social? You refer to Marcel Sahalin, Culture and Practical Reason. And Sahalin was in battle with the sociobiologists. But the crucial question now in thinking about social cultural is that how do we bring the biosocial, biocultural to the social, which is not just an continuation of project of sociobiology. And the social itself, theoretically, how do we think about the social? Indian philosopher Daya Krishna has a very deep foundational question in thinking about society. He says there are two ways of thinking about society. One is sociocentric and the other is Atman-centric. The point is that even our view of social, and that is a fundamental question for anthropology also, therefore, the ethnography, Clifford Geer's, you cite Clifford Geer's work on agricultural involution. Geer's talks about an ethnography of modern thought. Therefore, as anthropologists, therefore, is it enough just to bring the concept of the social, or are we also fundamentally challenged to understand what is the logic of the social? For example, following Daya Krishna, that how the logic of the social is at the same time a struggle with a sociocentric conception, and at the same time it deals with the Atman-centric world. And in a way, it also relates to your work on aspiration. The second question is that the book is entitled Rural Ontology. Though you briefly mentioned about epistemology, and very interestingly, you raised that how the questions are not just technical questions, they're epistemological questions. But what is your concept of ontology? You write that that Bourdieu's book is a Bible for you, but Bourdieu also has written a book called The Political Ontology of Martin Heidegger. So my query is that this whole ontology, is ontology just a word? But if there is a substantive dimension to an ontological approach, and what kind of elaboration it requires? For example, is it an essentialist ontology, or what Gianni Vattimo, the deep contemporary European philosopher, talks about weak ontology? So these are some of my submissions, please. Thank you for your kind consideration. Maybe at this juncture, let us hear, Arjun, your thoughts on this, and then if time permits, we would invite more questions and comments, please. Yeah.
So, thank you, and thank you, Anant, but also to everyone before you, starting with Amrit, if I'm not mistaken, and there were at least 3 or 4 in between. So the compass or horizon of the questions is quite considerable. So I would be grateful as I speak if I'm reminded by Anant or by any of you of something I have failed to completely left out because I'm not taking notes, because I'm not a big multitasker these days. When I'm listening, I can't write. When I'm writing, I can't do something else. It's a little disability. But I find it helps me to look and listen properly rather than writing notes. And I'll wait for the recording. Anyway, Anant, let me start with you, then go back to Amrit, and then come back to the questions in the middle, which have a certain overlap among them, I believe. Your questions, of course, very searching and very wide-ranging. Maybe I take up the question of ontology, which is used certainly in the book, but I had to keep reminding myself not to retro-engineer all my thoughts of the last 40 years back into that time. So I had to take care in the introduction to more or less extract, but also bound myself to what I saw and thought at that time. And that is, of course, a hazardous endeavor, because it then looks to somebody who's reading the book as a new book, as if I have been in a sleeping like Rip Van Winkle for 40 years, but what to do? So I would say today, I would very much take on, for example, the whole movement towards non-human agencies. So even apart from Indian philosophical traditions like Atman traditions, which I am very interested in, even coming from anthropology, I would say that we now have a much deeper sense of agencies, activities, intentions, motives, which are not strictly and narrowly human. Animals, plants, machines, robots, rocks, birds, bees, and many other things besides are now seriously discussed. And what they have done is also revive old topics like animism, totemism, etc. So there is a lot to be said there. But like I say, I didn't want to retro interject as if I was already thinking in 2020 terms in 1980, which I was not. So everything in the book and even in my introduction, and that is why, by the way, there is not a conclusion, which is a good point. I could have done one, but it would have been very hard in a conclusion to avoid sort of retro and saying, this is true today, that is the reason. I wanted to stay close to that period, though I'm convinced that there's still a lot that is relevant then. But especially for my own thinking, I wanted to stay in that frame with all my interlocutors, people who influence me, etc., rather than say what I would say today. So that is as far as the ontology question. The question of voices, yeah, I am sure that the chapters or essays as I wrote them would have benefited from more voices, situated people, even if anonymized. But I think that because I was writing for various particular conferences, books, edited collections, I was more moved towards the subject rather than highlighting the closer to the ground notes that I had from individuals about this. I was trying to extract something. And that was also in a setting where I was in quite active dialogue with economists, particularly, and very good ones, Pradhan, Rudra, Srinivasan, and others. So I wanted to appeal to their attention, and giving them a lot of voices would have moved them even further away. I mean, someone like Ashok Rudra already found that what I was doing was too far from his thoughts. So we had some very vivid debates. But if I had done a lot of kind of more Goethean or other kind of voice-based writing, it would have made it even harder to know what my interlocutors in economics could use or in agrarian sociology could use. So that's just some context. It may also have to do with my own style of writing and thinking. But you're right, more voices would have certainly illuminated in, let's say, the measurement chapter, why all this matters. The other general comment I'll make, which may now take us backwards towards Amrit's opening comment and to some of the ones in between, is that I was not trying to write a book or even those chapters about inequality. Inequality is a giant topic, but not everything about agriculture, farming, etc. is about inequality. So I didn't want to claim, you see, some major new insight about inequality, because as we know, when we read Indian anthropology, sociology, and even agrarian sociology, peasant studies, there's a huge amount of work on inequality, and yet there are some basic unanswered things. Like I said, why in India is there not a major peasant revolution? Barrington Moore asked this question. Till today, there is no answer to that. There is a lot of, there could be this, could be that. In Tanjavur, this happened, and somewhere else that happened. But we don't have a good general understanding. But I wanted to simply say, let us take a closer look linguistically, culturally, and cosmologically at how people engaged in farming think about their world. That does mean everyone, but it means some angle. And that, of course, is closely connected to inequality. I hope it will cast some light on it for those people, say like Professor Mohanty, but many others, distinguished scholars, who are really thinking hard and regularly about inequality. I hope it will cast some light from left or right, from some small angle here or there. But I was not aiming to directly say, you have said A and B about inequality, let me tell you a different view. I don't really have a different view. I'm just trying to understand the same thing. Why is it persistent? Why does it vary? Of course, I can't argue about a variation point because I'm in one place. So I can't say why is it different from Tanjore or Haryana or Mizoram. I can take some guesses, but I stick to my place and hope that this material will raise for others who have done work on agrarian relations and all, some questions of a similar type. How do people estimate this or that? It goes to one other question that several people raised. Two questions I'll quickly address. One is originally raised by Professor Mohanty also, the cultural and structural, shall we say. And that was certainly something that was made a central problem when I was being educated as a graduate student, even as an undergraduate. That is, how do we reconcile? And it's a big problem. It's a big problem because unless we make structure something completely mechanical and culture something airy, fantasy, they are very closely, you might even say they are two sides of the same coin. One is the ideational side and one is the, shall we say, institutional regularity side. So structure is institutions, is regulations, it's agencies, like that. Culture is like the petrol that's going inside, the ideas, shall we say. And unless we think all humans have exactly the same ideas about everything, we have to find the petrol in this situation or that situation. Now, it may be that structurally, many of those situations resemble each other, but we know from those who have studied inequality very seriously, both in India and elsewhere, that inequality itself, if you take something like feudalism, is variable. Japanese form is not the European form, which is not the Indian form. And I would say, in this regard, my own teacher or broad influence is Max Weber. Therefore, Max Weber spent his whole life in a dialogue with Marx. That's why I say I do have a connection. A, because I have read 3 or 4 pages of Marx in my life, but also because my orientation is Max Weber, who had a lot to say on many of these things and left a deep, deep influence on me, which is not in the front pages of this book, but informs my thinking about legitimacy, charisma, political movements, mobilization, enterprise, etc., all these things. So I just point to the fact that the culture structure question is one of those deep, hard to quickly catch, but I am deeply conscious of it. And I'm very much trying to say that this angle on culture that I take might be informing to somebody who wants to explain other kinds of persistence or exclusion or this one. That is the impulse. Two other quick things, but let me first say on Amrit's point about brokerage. In every part of Indian society, again, I had to be a bit careful because I was trying to illuminate what I saw in the early 80s. But in the case of the broker state, etc., I took these ideas from much more recent work. But somehow it seemed to me to cast a retrospective light also. And I think you have said some very suggestive things in your comments, such as the fact that even wealthier farmers are enmeshed in a very big structure, which is regional, which then accounts, which then, let's say, if you just take Marathas, we know that in Maharashtra, Marathas are crucial to the structure of power. That's gone back to cooperative movement, sugar, Sharad Pawar. It's wall-to-wall Maratha domination, and that domination is very capillary. So if you have a huge politician in Pune having a marriage, 3,000 poor farmers come to the food celebrations. They come from all over, 50 miles, 100 miles, just to eat there and to show their faces. Though they are not important, but they're not important to the power of the main family having the wedding. But it is the way that the Maratha political network goes from YB Chavan and Sharad Pawar down to the 2-hectare guy. There is a series of paths. So I do think that is important. I couldn't and didn't get much chance to explore that. And why I bring it up in relation to your question is that the 25-hectare person in my village is a tiny cog in the Maratha machine of the whole state. That is a guarantee. He is not a king of all he surveys. He is hugely dependent on banks, loans, this, that, which eventually require district level politics, which then, and somebody, I think Professor Mohanty brought up the state. It's a very dim presence in my book, and it should be a stronger presence to illuminate this, that even the rich farmers are not, that free. They are playing a role. And the one other comment I wanted to make about that is that the upper farmers, as well as, let's say, the Zilla Parishad people, the Patwaris, the people who maintain these are all the local actors who actually tell you where is your land, what can you fight, where is the boundaries, how much revenue, etc. That these upper people are a kind of like a hinge, where when looking out, they may have to take into account the strict measures for loans or for other monetary market prices, this, that. But when they look inward, they have to deal with approximation, roughness, all the things I talk about. So in a way, they themselves are binocular. They operate in both worlds. So several people asked the question about measurements, that we are in a capitalist world. Yes, true. But if you do look at even wholesale vegetable markets, say in Bombay or in Pune, and really examine, which a few people have done, and now more people are doing, what goes on there. There is a lot of give and take. There is a lot of the principle which we call in India, adjust. My truck broke down, so today we have this much, but let's adjust against something else. And before you know it, you're in a world which is not so tightly defined. And I will tell you that holds at many levels. But going back to your question, Amrit, I do think that the situation of the Indian rural hierarchy or sociology is that no one is free of some intermediary, subordinate, or sub-patron role in relation to somebody else. And no one is free of that until you get the very top of state politics, which is half a foot in Delhi. Even then you are dependent on this one, that one. But if you're an upper farmer, for example, you are also caught in a very big network of things. Doesn't mean you are, again, I want to be careful to say, it doesn't mean you are equal. But it means you are also subject to all sorts of demands, pressures, and so on. And your ability to exercise your power over those below you is also somewhat defined by what constrains you. So you can't just absolutely say this one is the powerful, that one is powerless, etc. So overall, let me just conclude by saying that though I may have missed some of the questions that were raised, for reasons of time, let me at least say that I do think some of these are very enduring questions. One is all this interest that I show in, let's say, local cosmologies and ideologies of growth, friendship, relationality, measurement, etc. What do they tell us about inequality? And certainly that is not clear in the book. I hope my interest in inequality is clear. And I will say now, as a few people in this room know, Amrit certainly knows, I am returning to the subject of caste, which I have stayed away from for a long time because so dense, to ask the question, with Dalits, for example, much more prominently present in my thinking than they were 40 years ago. So, but that's other work. It's not in this book for this discussion, but I'm giving you some sense that I'm also thinking about that issue separately. And then the inequality question is large, but it's not the question of my book. It's adjacent to, close to, connected to, but it's not the question. The second thing is that this culture structure is a very old thing. It won't go away. And as somebody mentioned, Popkin and one of our interlocutors, Popkin and Scott. And yes, when I was doing this work, every period where one does research is embedded in a certain world of references. I was reading Amartya Sen's early work on entitlement, famines, long before his other work. There was a climate in which the Scott-Popkin debate was very important, and where rationality meant cost benefit, this, that. My feeling is that's an absurdly narrow definition of rationality. And so I want to broaden it somehow. And it also speaks to, I think, some of Anand's questions about how to represent these epistemologies and how to, for example, I agree 100% that the hostility, so I've always been a strong critic of Salins, that there was too much absolutism about culture. And it's not my style. It's also not very empirical because it says, by definition, indigenous cosmologies will swallow up the colonial people. They don't empirically. I mean, it varies. So I disagree in many ways, but the point you are making, and I'll close with this, is that today that seems a very narrow and not very helpful critique, because we have a whole body of work in neurology, in affect theory, in somatic theory, etc., even leaving aside the Indic traditions, which have had a lot to say. Even from the West itself, there is a feast of material that therefore sociality must also include elements not just of ethnography, but of ethology. We have to observe all kinds of ways of connecting and bonding and so on, which may come from the animal world or the fruit world or the flower world. So I'm totally with you that one needs to expand that. But again, I did not want to make any wisdom I had retrospective and say I was already thinking about this. I wasn't. So that's the way it is. Anyway, I'll stop there, Anand. And with your kind permission, and perhaps to the relief of many, I must request that you permit me to say goodbye, because my energies are not anywhere near, either they are indefinite rather than infinite. So I'd like to.
So we request just 2 minutes presence. So just 2 to 3 minutes.
Sure.
So Minati, we have Minati, who is one of our co-nurturers. She might ask a very small question, and she would also thank you. So Minati, please.
Yeah, thank you, Ananta bhai. But I feel we are running short of time. I don't know. I just okay. So if you have given the opportunity, I will just like to keep my the small question. Like, I'm actually enriched by Professor Arjun Appadurai's presentation and the discussion what is going on here. So I am learnt manifold. what I just wanted to ask, I wanted to listen a little bit more about the roles of women, as one chapter is there, gender consumption, and I have not gone through the complete book. And I just wanted to ask, what is your observation of the gender role in agriculture in today's society? I mean, how do you compare when your time cited in that book and in the today's present time? So that is a small query, if you could answer. Thank you.
Sorry, I missed something at the end. Somebody else was speaking, or?
Yeah, the question was very, the gender role in agriculture. This is what
Correct.
Minati asked.
Correct. So I thank you very much. I wish, that I had devoted more time to what is now in one chapter. But in fact, women are involved in all of this because they are, I say this in a short sentence in that chapter, that there is nothing they do not do. They are involved with the fields, they are involved with the animals, they are involved with the goats, they are involved with the marriages, they are involved with the funerals, they are involved with caretaking at home, they are so really to talk about women is to talk about the full fan of their presence. And so in a way, I did not know how to highlight that, except in this food and other thing where I wanted to also say it is not just a matter of doing the home cooking, it is part of the fabric of the social. That is that you are a key player in how you get along and relate to others at every level. But that could be said also of other ritual occasions, of work in the fields, not so much of migration, which tended to be very male, but certainly of labor on other people's fields. So it's of course, that is why one of these people said to me, if I tell you my troubles in Marathi, she said, तुझा ढोका जळून झाला. Your head will burn. She simply said that to me, and I got the point that if she really told me her troubles, my head would be on fire. And that was not a unique statement, because there was a lot of expression of the tremendous burdens that were being borne by women and which were multi-sectoral. The question about today, I'm less able to answer except by changing the scale and saying I have a general impression, as you do or others do, what is going on in different parts of India, farmer suicides, dowry issues, gender violence, physical violence against women. I have a general idea, but it's not from that place at this time to do a kind of comparison. But I would say, if I may hazard a kind of broad descriptive speculation, I would say that that there is a very clear and fearful symmetry between the historical changes in the role of women and in the role of Dalits in the last 20, 30, 40 years. And though with women it has been a quieter process, with Dalits it's clear that they are now in the public sphere in a way that they were not 50 years, 60 years, 70 years ago. And that's irreversible. With women, it's a slow process, but there is something similar. And I think the result is a lot more rage against women and against Dalits. A lot more physical violence, a lot more humiliation. And I say a lot more, not just quantitatively, because that's always difficult to measure, but the quality. The humiliation followed by distribution of videos, the public hangings. This is the display aspect with both these categories to me is noticeable. And for me, that is the other side of, as it were, moving beyond your awqat. And I am now following this concept of awqat closely, that it is a very key thing in contemporary India, that this lot more rage is directed to people who are seen to be stepping beyond their awqat. And notable among them is women of all categories and Dalits. So I would say that's the change that I see, is progress, but anger provoked by the progress.
Thank you. Ananta bhai, should we close or we will?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
No, you can please offer yours.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for your answers, Professor. I, Minati Pradhan, on behalf of Socialism Chakra and Vishwaneedam Center for Asian Blossoming, would like to thank our today's chief speaker, Professor Arjun Appadurai, and would like to congratulate for his books. May hope that many more insights people will get after reading that. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. And I also would like to thank today's discussant, Professor B.V. Mohanty and Professor Hira Singh. Thank you, sir, and thank you, ma'am, for just pitching in and giving us your insights.
Sorry, Minati, Professor Hira Singh is not madam, Professor Mr. Hira Singh.
No, just I wanted to thank you and thank again Arjun Appadurai for taking all the questions, and I loved his answers, including the last ones.
Thank you,
So-
and my apologies for becoming a little
Oh, no
intemperate.
apology. No, this is open field. I'm loud mouthed. I love you and I love your work, but I disagree with you. That's all.
Oh, no,
And honestly, I was very keen to see you because I've been hearing about you a lot. I never had a chance to see you. Hopefully,
Thanks.
we stay in touch. By the way, Weber
Yes.
is one of my victims. I read Weber with marks, and I'm going to send you a paper on Weber that I wrote, which has
I would
reached
love that.
about 55,000 readership.
Wow.
So yeah, I'll send that to you. I'd love your comments actually, because Weber and Marx, that's what I do. I teach social theory,
Superb, superb.
and I
I'm
do
very grateful. And overall, I want to say to everyone who has spoken today, the formal discussants, as well as Anant and his colleagues in this wonderful center, as well as everybody else. I'm sorry if there are a couple of questions that, because of the overall richness of the data that came to me, I missed a couple of things, but I believe there is a recording, and I will wait for that, look for that.
No,
and
no,
then
I'll definitely send. Where can I send it to you?
Anant has
can-
my email.
What I'll do,
Yeah.
I'll email to Anant, and he will
Very
forward.
good. Very
Yeah.
good idea. Anant is, after all, the still center in a whirling world. So he's the right man to say.
I have known Anant for the last, I don't know how many years, more than 40 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
He's a worthy mentee.
No, he's just brilliant, and especially, I don't know if I should say, I and my wife have always been fighting over she loves Professor Mohanty, Professor Ananta Giri. Yeah,
That's a good
and
thing.
it was Professor Mohanty who brought us together, and there of course because I think she was a student that time when Professor Giri, he was not Professor Giri that time, but he was leaving for his PhD. And I had gone back from Canada, and we met, and I think that was our last meeting before we met again in Chennai. So, no, he has been a very close, I trust him, and if he says anything, I just agree to come there. So that
I do too. So I will say my goodbyes to all of you. And again, special thanks, Anant, for organizing this really wonderful.
My apologies to Professor Hira Singh. Sorry, I addressed you as ma'am, but I really sorry, extremely sorry for that.
that's okay.
So, but we really
We
thank
have
you.
all risen above gender. No worries, we are all
No,
risen above.
gender is, and especially, actually, one thing I wanted to say again, Arjun, before you
Yes.
leave, actually, I like the write-up on women. Actually, that's very sensitive and very well done part.
Professor, if you could answer my question, I mean, I had a question earlier.
Yes. But, tell me, who is that speaking now?
Dr. Tamanna Khosla, sir.
Yes, please remind me. I said I missed some things.
Yes, sir, please. I mean,
Tell
I
me.
really wanted to know.
Please repeat.
Yes. Tamanna. Hello.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Tamanna, please
So,
repeat your question.
please.
Yes, sir. Yes,
Yeah.
sir. Sir, I wanted to know, like, are capitalist societies better for farmers and the allies, or are the socialist countries better? So
I remember your question now very clearly. It's a tough one because it involves both a historical and a sociological comparison on an international basis or a global
yes,
basis.
sir. Yes, sir.
It's a tough one, but I can give you my sort of intuition, which is more like a gamble or a speculation. I think it's the smaller scale socialist societies. Vietnam is an example.
Yes.
Some of the African countries are. Cuba used to be, because none of them is huge and they can make policies effective at a relatively intimate level, and they have a socialist heritage, but that heritage has not become sclerotic, so that it's become totalitarian, greedy, autocratic, the Putin effect, the China effect. That's because they have millions to handle, huge enemies, so they become, all twisted. But the smaller ones who are not every day facing crisis are able to do social things. And I just give you those few examples, but that's my idea, at least in theory. If you could keep the scale small, have the idea of socialist principles, both at the level of local production systems, but also planning, some kind of thing. But the minute the planning becomes like India, Niti Bhavan, and before that,
Yes, yes.
planning commission, for millions, billions of people. There are 10
Yes,
guys, half of whom are from Bengal, of course, which is a good thing, but still a few others are needed from other parts of the world who are telling us what to do. Then things start going wrong because the scale is just too big. Anyway, that's sorry I overlooked. I knew there were some good things missing that I overlooked.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for reminding me. Thank you.
So let me, complete the vote of thanks. I'm halfway way. So I also would like to thank our participants today, Professor Amrit Srinivasan, Professor Ranju Hasini Sahu, Papes Lenka, and Dr. Tamanna Khoshla, and the other people who are present in our Facebook platform and as well as in our YouTube platform. Please pardon me if I have forgotten anybody's name, but I really thank all of you being our co-traveler in our this journey. Thank you all. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll say bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.